Welcome back, everybody. It's me, Jaiska. In my last video, we finished going over Friedrich Engels' Principles of Communism, and as promised, the next book I was going to go over is this one right here. It's Blackshirts and Reds, Rational Fascism and the Overthrow of Communism by Dr. Michael Parenti. He's one of my favorite Marxist intellectuals who is still alive today. The work he does is really great. He has a lot of good lectures.
You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Most countries are rich. The Philippines are rich. Brazil is rich. Mexico is rich. Chile is rich. Only the people are poor. But there's billions to be made there, to be carved out and to be taken. There's been billions for 400 years. The capitalist European and North American powers have carved out and taken the timber, the flax, the hemp, the cocoa, the rum, the tin, the copper, the iron, the rubber, the bauxite, the slaves, and the cheap labor. They have taken out of these countries. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
A lot of really well-written books that are not only highly informational, but digestible. They're not written the same way that some other Marxists write their books, where they're all very terminology heavy. He makes his content very simple, very understandable, and for that reason I think he's one of the most valuable thinkers on our side of the modern day. So in the preface to his book, he asks us, the reader, that we consider the arguments he makes critically, but open-mindedly. That's pretty self-explanatory, but basically do think for yourself, do challenge, do push the ideas that come up, but don't do so in a way that rejects them before you engage with them. He suggests that mainstream ideology has equated fascism and communism as two totalitarian evils of the 1900s, and that at least a portion of his book will be dedicated to challenging that idea. He said that popular notion would suggest that Western democracy has opposed both fascism and communism equally, but if you look at the actual history, what happens is that capitalism will resort to fascism to preserve itself in the name of saving democracy from communism. So many believe that communism failed as an ideology in 1991 after the fall of the USSR, and that the future henceforth is one of capitalist nature. But Parenti begs the question, what future do we have under capitalism? He brings up that we're killing the planet for profit, that we're pretty much draining all of our resources, that climate change, even when he wrote the book in 1997, is already advancing way faster than we thought it would, and that it'd be irreversible. We know now that it in fact is irreversible. 3, that we as the working people are born into a world where we inherently surrender our liberty, our birthrights, and our futures in favor of a very small handful of ruling class individuals ruining the planet behest themselves. Lastly, he mentions that existing rule has always presented itself in a way that is correct and natural, that it imposes itself, that it implies that the way that rule is the way that it always has and always will be. And historically we've seen that with divine rule, the mandate of heaven, where these leaders would create ways to justify their power, ways that don't really check out logically, but justify themselves and instill those ideas into their people so early on that they don't question them, even when they can think more critically and independently. In this comes combating any dissenting views, suppressing them, censoring them, what have you. Alright, kicking it off into chapter 1, we have Rational Fascism. That is the name of this chapter. Parenti opens up with an anecdote talking about him going on a walk throughout Little Italy in New York, I believe, where there was a t-shirt vendor handing out shirts with Benito Mussolini, the founder of fascism, doing a salute, his salute. And when he asked the vendor why, the vendor said, some people actually like this stuff, and honestly, maybe the world needs more people like Mussolini, which to Parenti served as an example that fascism as an ideology is still alive and well. So, works since the end of World War II have surfaced, trying to sanitize fascist history by re-evaluating and explaining fascist figures in history. So, most of this content dodges the question of class entirely. It'll ignore concepts like labor conditions and social services, and who benefited economically. So, in the first official section of the chapter, plutocrats choose autocrats, meaning people with wealth-based power, the capitalists, favor absolute rulers, which is what an autocrat is, someone with an absolute governance over their nation. He opens up talking about the founder of fascism, Benito Mussolini. And goes over some of his youth. So in his youth, Mussolini was actually a socialist. He helped with labor movements, strikes, and organizing, things of that nature. But it was suspected by his peers that he was an opportunist and that he was self-interested, which turned out to be exactly the case, because once there were offers brought to him by corporate interests for fame, power, and financial support, he completely folded on all of his previous values, and Mussolini the socialist became Mussolini the fascist. So this man that used to help with labor movement and strikes, things of that nature, was now breaking up said strikes. And him and his group of the Blackshirts, hence the title of the book, would break up labor movements and harass strikers, assault organized protests, things with the help and financial support that he was offered. He quickly rose into power. So the doctrines of the newly fascist Mussolini were jingoism, a type of militaristic nationalism or patriotism, anti-socialist reactionaryism, as I said, with him and his group completely, ravaging social movements around Italy, and anti-labor rights, which is pretty self-explanatory considering the actions I just described. So, they harassed and assaulted all types of labor movements, because post-World War I Italy, after an L in World War I, was in complete recession. The expensive war between, the actual money, the materials, the time, the manpower, the lives lost, it was really expensive, so big industry in Italy was struggling. And to compensate for this, to bring themselves back, they made changes to keep the profits that they were making at the expense of their workers. And that came in the form of wage cuts, welfare cuts, heavier taxing, in a form similar to post-Ronald Reagan United States. This led to a robust labor movement in Italy of workers that would organize and seek better conditions, better pay, and organizing rights, which they actually did end up winning. But the corporations, as a result of this, sought to then get rid of those rights, get rid of organized labor, and get rid of civil liberty, so that way they could secure the positions that they had beforehand and get those profits back. So what they did is they used Mussolini as a tool to do so, him and his fascists, the Blackshirts, and then with support from Italian banking and agribusiness capitalists and the top chiefs of the military and the police, he took over Italy in a coup. Once Mussolini got into power, he would purge dissidents. He banned other parties, even though his party only had 20% of the support. He banned the free press. He especially repressed pro-labor organizations, which meant communists, which is already kind of poking holes in the narrative that fascism is somehow a mutation of a left-wing ideology. A similar case in Germany arose, another World War I loser whose industry suffered after their defeat. Fascists and capitalists worked together to secure a beneficial position for capitalists. The Nazi SA, the brown shirts, or the stormtroopers, not to be mistaken with those from Star Wars, were an anti-labor paramilitary force that was funded by German corporations alongside Hitler, because the current German government was making too many concessions for the working class, and the corporations needed something to change in their recession, and they needed it to happen quickly. The Nazi Party was pretty unpopular, except with the higher middle class and the rich of Germany. And at the time, most people in Germany either supported ideologies closer to a social democracy, which I left a definition for in my last video, but I'll leave one here as well, and or communist ideology. The Social Democrats were a huge part of why Hitler came to power, because rather than making common cause with the communists, they ended up siding with the fascists, which has been a pattern historically speaking to them at the time, better than making like a last-minute alliance with the communists, since social democracy upholds capitalism with more welfare programs and like a stronger state apparatus. It's heavier taxed, and those taxes go into those programs for the people, whereas communism is completely flipping the order of worker and owning class and giving the industries back to the workers entirely. The German Nazi agenda was pretty similar to that of Italy, where they banned elections, banned organized labor, banned opposition parties, purged hundreds of thousands of dissidents. It's these two completely separate societies, so they're completely different in their history, in their socioeconomic conditions up to this point, in their cultures, and yet they resorted to nearly identical measures to stomp out labor movements because of similar, class conflict, similar economic powers wanting certain changes made. Fascism was also instrumental in preserving capitalism from unfavorable democracies at the time in countries such as Spain, Hungary, Lithuania, Croatia, Romania, and more. I think Portugal was one as well. Culture was also a big part of it, such as the rampant anti-Semitism and racial supremacy that we saw in Nazi Germany compared to fascist Italy. Anti-Semitism was weaponized for elite class interest for capitalists in Germany. Our next section of the chapter is called Who Did the Fascists Support? So, in power, Hitler and Mussolini both supported big capitalism and gutted labor power and labor movements by violently repressing organized labor, giving all union and farming cooperative property to capitalists. Third, they abolished minimum wages, safety regulations, and child labor laws. They cut wages by 40 to 50%. So imagine you're making, $11 an hour at your job. All of a sudden, you're down to $5.50 or $6 an hour, and forced to keep working. Also, they completely eradicated overtime pay. They privatized a lot of the enterprises and businesses that were under the control of the government and gave those assets to capitalists. They funded capitalists with money from the public treasury. They made a regressive tax that was high for the working class people, but was either extremely low or non-existent altogether for the ruling class. And for corporations. They completely abolished taxes on inheritance. Massive money moving from one generation to the next was completely unhindered by a tax of any kind. And what this led to was corruption, massive amounts of public debt, economic recession, but it was industries that were benefiting from it, and weapons factories were booming while both Italy and Germany were preparing for war and upping production of weapons in their factories. So despite all of these things that these two did to crush labor, historians ignore fascism's mutually beneficial relationship with capitalism. Right-wing pundits and historians will distort the relationship into being government control of business, right? Which is really important, because what it does is it leads to this faulty conclusion that fascism is a mutated weird offspring of socialism, despite the complete repression of labor force and government support for private business. Hitler constantly spoke of saving industry from Bolshevism as an ideology. Bolshevism being the Marxism Leninism ideology that sprang out of the USSR after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the October Revolution. Italy's fascist party and Germany's Nazi party elites lived lavishly. And the way that they did so and the way that they secured these comfortable lifestyles was through stealing from people that they imprisoned, plundering conquered land, selling slave labor, taxing their namesake within their cults of personality. So anytime one of their faces or one of their names were used in a publication, despite the fact that their countries were completely, developing these obsessions with these two as great leaders, they would be taxed. So both, they were able to rack up, the equivalent of tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars by, taxing their namesake in a society where, their name's literally everywhere. The last couple things that they did to secure their own wealthy lifestyles were the expropriation of public property for themselves, like really valuable artwork in museums, and illegal slush funds. A slush fund being political bribery money coming from capitalists going into a secret account that they would fund a really extravagant lifestyle. The next section of the chapter, kudos for Adolf and Benito. What it means by kudos is that American corporate press and our ruling class capitalists supported these fascist regimes. What he means by that is that these U.S. capitalists, such as Ford and some of the bankers, would gladly do business with these regimes at the time and would help the Nazi buildup in their war effort. They would leak military info from the U.S., and they continued to do so even after we joined the war. They also continued doing business with Germany and Italy. They would fly out to Rome or to Berlin just to secure deals with these fascists. And U.S. corporate media praised Mussolini because they said that he was the savior of Italy from radicalism and from anarchy, saving them from a revolution, even though his coming into power was a pseudo-revolution, which we'll get into in a moment. Our press completely fabricated an image of what Italy was at the time to make their government more popular with our people here in America, since our relationship with them was it was good. We were friendly, very positive in how we would depict Italy, to the point where we were being inaccurate in how we would do Italian press that was in the U.S. even pushed for the policies that Mussolini had installed in Italy to be pushed in the United States. So American anti-fascists and progressives of all kinds of different strides completely denounced all forms of fascism, because people at the time were very, it was a very clear difference between the purpose that communism and fascism served, although now pundits and some historians try to mystify the differences and conflate the two. Nazi funds were given to certain press groups in the United States to bolster the image of Nazism. There was a movement in our press called Give Adolf a Chance. People were getting fired for refusing to put in good images and good press about Adolf and his regime. This continued all the way up and until the latecomers to industrialism and to colonial expansion, which were Germany, Italy, and Japan. Once they pushed for more colonial resources and for a bigger global market share through their expansionist policies and their desire to invade other places. It was only at that point, once the existing hegemony for global money dominance, global finance capital, once it was threatened, that was the first point that we completely spun the way that we depicted the regimes in our media, and all of a sudden it wasn't give them a chance. It wasn't we should copy what Mussolini is doing. It was we have to stomp out fascism. We have to get rid of this ideology, even though it wasn't the ideology that our corporate interests were worried about so much as the threat that the two nations pushing these ideologies were having on our global dominance of money. All right, next bit of the chapter: rational use of irrational ideology. So, when covering fascism, some authors stress its irrational nature, the fact that as an ideology it makes no sense. But in doing so, they ignore the very rational, very practical purpose that fascism served, and what he meant by that was the emotional appeal that fascist ideology had in controlling and maintaining current class structure. Both societies of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, like I said, had extremely strong cults of personality. Hitler's nickname, I'm not going to say it in German, I'll completely butcher it, but Google Translate says that it translates to the principle of fire. And Mussolini, Il Duce, I think is how you might say it. His blown up personality, this mythified version of him, was the Duke, or the Ducks. And with worship of these two figures came worship of the state itself, which is something that both ideologies pushed for later. Mussolini himself said that fascism only values its citizens to the extent of what they can provide to the state. He also said that values such as war and conquest should be upheld, while they reject ideology of peace, of democracy, of egalitarianism, because they are weak. And funny enough, the rhetoric that he would push about this, pro-war, pro-conquest, to achieve your full worth, to reach your potential, you have to do so through fighting, through conquest. It didn't hold up at all. So for his conscripted troops, a lot of them, the hype from this rhetoric would wear off immediately as soon as actual battle started, and they realized, like, okay, well, this is for real. Like, these people, firing at us are using live ammunition. Like, this is actual war. And a lot of them would just completely, they would just go. So, fascism pushes monistic values, meaning that they reduce the goals of society into one principle, ideology that went under phrases like this in Germany of one people, one rule, one leader. And they would aim to further the nation and its leader, and saw that that was the purpose of any individual in the fascist state. This is obviously an irrational way of thinking, since you or I will obviously more clearly identify with someone who's of a similar socioeconomic status to us pretty much from anywhere else in the world. So just by virtue of being from the same place, you or I wouldn't say that we relate to people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or the Waltons or Bill Gates, whatever. We wouldn't say that we relate to those people more than we do some low middle class suburban family from any moderately developed country. It makes no sense. But this irrational ideology served to silence social injustice and class struggle by perpetuating the existing status quo, by devaluing the question of class and prioritizing identifying with your nation. Historically speaking, fascists have taken common cause by striving for these mythical caricatures, if you will, these glorifications of civilizations that preceded them. So for fascist Italy, it was the image that they had built up of ancient Rome, and for Nazi Germany, it was the image of the ancient Volk people, which they saw as the roots and the ideals that they should strive for in their society, applied to a more modern context, at least modern in their time. So this was made apparent by all kinds of media pushed by either regime at the time, propaganda, which would suggest that the class struggle was dying out, that it was irrelevant, and that people had picked up the experience of Volk community, of becoming one. They dismissed the idea that class struggle would ever end and said that rather we should unite under our identity as descendants of these, of the ancient Volk or of the ancient Romans, and live up to their image, rather than addressing the class contradictions and the differences that come with the lifestyles of people of different classes. So Parenti concludes this section by saying that this kind of propaganda, explicitly displayed a very acute awareness for class struggle, but like I was saying, rather than ignoring the question, they acknowledged it and rather diverted away from it and said that this other value that they were pushing of community of nationalism should be taking precedence. The next section is Patriarchy and Pseudo-Revolution. Historically, fascism would abuse social circumstances, like your spawn point, which by that I mean, the socioeconomic status you're born into, your race, your nationality, your sex, and they would even abuse patriarchal values to justify people's positions in society, economically speaking, so rich or poor. And they would do this in ways similar to some older and some newer versions of these ideas, such as eugenics, race realism, and other pseudoscientific doctrines that seek to justify inequality. Another one is bell curve theory. Another thing that Hitler and his regime abused to stabilize the position of the ruling class in Germany was homophobia, and he did so by persecuting hundreds of the SA officials, the ones that that I mentioned helped his rise up because of their populist rhetoric for wealth distribution of the capitalist class. So he used the state power that they had helped him take to take them out of power. Because at first he didn't think that these allegations that there were a lot of high-ranking officials in the SA that they were gay, him and his regime didn't care. But it was when they started threatening the interests that Hitler was brought up by and that he was reinforcing, that's when all of a sudden them being gay was a problem. And a lot of the people that were executed when he was purging these SA officials for being gay weren't even gay. So that isn't to say Nazis weren't at the time and even today still homophobic, because that would be ahistorical. They definitely are. But that their homophobia comes from a different place. It comes from their conservative values of traditional family, because they think that a homosexual man is worthless because he isn't a father, he isn't a husband, and he isn't going to be producing more young men to eventually become workers and soldiers. For this same reason, they were anti-women's rights. They didn't like the idea of things like abortion or any means of lowering birth rates, because their militaristic values made them in favor of expanding their population as much as they could to have as many workers, soldiers, husbands, fathers as well as possible. This just meant that they stressed the traditional family structure, the one that we understand as, male head of the household, and below him is the woman, and below both of them their children. This type of patriarchy was especially helpful to capitalists because it kept women in line, which maintained the family structure, that existed. Those family structures are what made up the larger social structure of Germany, as they do everywhere else. You know, authority, privilege, wealth, all of these are things that would be threatened by social instability, but with keeping more oppressed populations in check, these are secured. On the topic of Nazi anti-Semitism, Jews at the time were there. I mean, anti-Semitism far precedes Nazi Germany. These already existing anti-Semitic ideas were used by Nazis as scapegoats for class interests. Let me give you some examples. Based off of who they were appealing to, Nazis would make Jews the scapegoat in different ways. They would misdiagnose capitalist, corporate oppression that, you know, the unemployed and that the low-paid knew were making their lives actively worse by saying that, no, it's not the capitalist, it's the Jewish banker, it's the Jewish business owner, it's the Jewish elite, you know, that you don't see, the one behind closed doors. And basically making the Jew into a caricature, into a boogeyman to blame and to rile people up, to make common cause with them and appeal to their interests. For the people that weren't poor, for the middle class, the Germans created the myth of what was called Judeo-Bolshevism, or Jewish communism would be another way of putting it. They thought that the Jewish communists were going to come and steal all their stuff and steal their toothbrush in their house, which worked splendidly for securing Nazi interests and reinforcing the capitalist class interests. Fascism, on the topic of pseudo-revolution, combines mass appeal and revolutionary rhetoric with reactionary right-wing politics. The National Socialist German Workers' Party was the name used because it brought on mass appeal, despite the party's huge share in the wealth strain. It was called the Workers' Party, but, you know, it was very well funded by corporate interests. As Parenti puts it, these Nazis, these fascists, would steal the left's thunder by copying not only their rhetoric, but their organizing strategies. Their organizing strategies, their talks of revolution, makes people today conflate the two. You know, there are people that will say, "Oh, Hitler was a socialist. Just look at his party name. It was the National Socialist German Workers' Party." Don't pay attention to anything he actually did. Just you know, try to pay attention to the name. You know, it says socialist, so it must be the case. These misrepresentations of, you know, both communism and fascism are done even by people on the left. Really popular left figurehead Noam Chomsky simplified the two as treating two as like twin totalitarian evils, completely ignoring the class interests of the two different ideologies. And despite people like him, intellectuals, making these mistakes, one, the people at the time took sides. There were very clear distinctions between fascists and communists, and the people at the time knew this, they recognized this, they saw those distinctions, and more importantly than that, so did the capitalists. Noam Chomsky, who is an anti-capitalist, should have been very cognizant of this idea that one is serving the existing capitalist interest and one seeks to completely overthrow it and put the workers at the top of society in its place, just as the capitalist interests recognized was the case, just as the workers of the time recognized was the case. Fascism had a very clear purpose, among others, in that it would completely solve class struggle. It would eradicate the internal contradictions that are inherent to capitalism by indefinitely suppressing the working class, the exploited masses. In Marxist theory, it suggests that class struggle is the driving force of progress. But if you completely suppress class struggle and you ignore the inherent contradictions by completely pushing down the class struggle to the point where it can never be addressed and the contradictions will never be fixed for the working class, then it doesn't matter because you're serving the capitalists anyway. You don't need to solve any contradictions for the working class because the capitalists are going to be nice and comfy and definitely. This fake revolution would leave old powers intact and intentionally mislead the public because they knew what they were doing. They knew that they were serving corporate interests, but they would make appeals to the masses anyways. Friendly to fascism. West capitalist states have in the past worked with fascist powers. At the time, The British saw Hitler as a militant anti-communist, which, as a ruling class British official, was obviously favorable. And they saw that his regime as a counterforce to communism throughout Germany, which again appealed to them. Nothing was done to extinguish the ideology of fascism in Europe after World War II ended. So there were the Nuremberg trials, where some of the officials from the fascist regimes were tried for their war crimes. But even then, the German reactionary forces would frame the Nazi war criminals as victims, and they would villainize the prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials as Jews and as communists. So the ideology, the fascists lost, but fascism as an ideology won. It prevailed. It still exists today. Even the Italian communists, who were instrumental because they had a armed struggle throughout World War II against the fascist power of Italy, they were deemed unpatriotic and they were publicly scrutinized. They became super unpopular with the public despite their effort in overthrowing the regime. The US, at the time, occupying these countries, oversaw the cops, the courts, the military, the security agency, the bureaucrats, and all of them stayed staffed by the same exact fascists that were in power before under Mussolini's regime and under Hitler's regime. On the topic of the Holocaust, as far as lives claimed, there are a recorded 6 million Jewish people killed during the Holocaust, 500,000 gypsies killed, several thousand homosexuals, several million Ukrainians, Russians, and Poles. And despite these lives lost, a lot of these war crimes, these crimes against humanity, went completely unpunished because a lot of the people that were investigating the crimes were complicit in committing the crime. It's like having a police investigation on police brutality. Obviously, you'd have an external force do it because if they're complicit, self-defeating, it's circular. When the communists took East Germany, on the other hand, which was divided up after World War II, they replaced 80%, 4 out of 5, of all of the teachers, of the judges, of the government officials, because of their collaboration with the Nazi regime. With that came the imprisonment of thousands of people, the execution of more than 600 Nazi party leaders, and and a lot of the Nazis that weren't ever prosecuted by the communists in East Germany, it was because they had escaped to West Germany, which was ruled by occupied by capitalist powers. Huge companies from the US that had supplied the Nazis in World War II that I was talking about before, even going as far as funding their weapons, their manufacturing, and actively helping them with machines that killed Americans, despite them being American businesses. Instead of being prosecuted for treason, as you'd expect, instead of being tried for treason, they got reparations. And when I say reparations, I don't mean that they got some of their assets restored. No, they were fine. I mean, they got back then what was several tens of millions of dollars, adjusted for inflation now might go into the hundreds of millions of dollars, for damages to their businesses done by bombings during the war. In addition to this, in World War II, American and British pilots were specifically told when doing bombing campaigns in Germany to avoid striking US-owned factories, because the factories were still operating. They were still creating weapons and technology and machinery for the Germans during the war, and we decided no, because after this war we're going to need those to still be there to keep doing business with these Germans. So from 1945 to 1975, we gave tens of millions of dollars to right-wing Italian organizations directly tied to fascists. And we worked alongside neo-fascists with our Secretary of State, one of the absolute worst people to ever live, Henry Kissinger, to prevent European communist influence. We worked alongside neo-fascists. Following the end of World War II, we had several hundreds of Nazi war criminals escaping the U.S. and finding sanction, finding safety, living the rest of their lives out peacefully here in the U.S. Or some of them got hired into U.S. Intelligence agencies, and some even joined the presidential campaigns of Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush Sr. Later came the strategy of tension, which was an anti-communist terrorism and sabotage campaign in the 60s and 70s, which was under the collaboration of Italian military intelligence personnel, civilian intelligence agencies, fascist Vatican officials, Gladio, which was an organization which was basically an anti-communist knockoff of NATO, mafia bosses at the time, actual NATO officials as well. So I guess it's a knockoff, which was specifically anti-communist, but we'll see later for sure. NATO was also very anti-communist. An organization called Ordine Nuovo, which was a fascist group. 30 generals and 8 admirals from Italy, Freemason leaders, and the whole thing was aided by the Central Intelligence Agency here in the United States, the CIA. What this terrorism entailed was kidnappings, assassinations, bombing massacres. Some bombings, such as the one in, I think it was Bologna, or I'm not sure how to say it. It's spelled like Bologna. Almost 100 people were killed as a result of the bombing, and another 200 were injured. These activities went pretty much completely unreported in U.S. corporate media, and it was essentially this massive campaign to suppress popular democratic leftism that was rising up at the time. So he concludes this section by saying that the fascists are still active, and not only are they active, but they have collaborated with and have active links to security agencies in the West. Nowadays, we have Italian neo-fascists, which copy the strategies of United States reactionaries in order to fulfill their political interests without doing so in a way that is mask off. They do so behind the guise of electoralism, remaining in class politics. Some of the things that they would replicate from our reactionaries here in the U.S. are the upbeat optimism and appeals to personality that we have for corporate servants, like we saw under Reagan. The villainization of big government, or of the government in general, especially towards social services and welfare programs, while hypocritically bolstering the more repressive forms of government, like police budgets and military. Another strategy they copied was the U.S. reactionary tendency to instigate racism and to villainize and increase hatred towards immigrants. Constant praise of the myth of the virtues of the free market. Codes that would favor the rich at the expense of the working class. He mentions that conservatives use a diluted fascist appeal to the masses while they serve corporate interests in a way similar to fascists, as I had described, and that any revolution by the right will end up serving old interests regardless. So I think I touched upon everything from chapter 1. Let's hope so, because man, it was a pretty loaded chapter. If you can go over that history, if you can hear everything that these fascist regimes were responsible for, and still say that they are a branch off from communism, or that they're similar, or that the two ideologies are equally bad in any way, you're being completely oblivious, at least in my perspective. Yeah, that was chapter 1 of Parenti's book, Blackshirts and Reds. Next, we'll be going over chapter 2. I won't go over what it is about, but the title of it is Let Us Now Praise Revolution. Until then, thank you for watching, and take care.